From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Today, all over our country, the American people understand that there is something profoundly wrong when we remain the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege.
Calling today a pivotal moment in American history, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is unveiling the Medicare for All Act to expand Medicare into a universal health care system. The bill is co-sponsored by 15 Senate Democrats and counting. Then to Trump's so-called Election Integrity Commission.
I would like to just make a suggestion that might possibly help overcome part of this problem, and that is think about applying the background check system that we use for purchasing guns, the NICS system, for voting.
As the Election Commission faces lawsuits, controversy, and the fallout from its second meeting on Tuesday, this one in New Hampshire, we'll look at how the so-called Election Integrity Commission may be paving the way for a nationwide voter suppression effort. Then, crime and punishment. Will the 9/11 case finally go to trial? On this week of the 16th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we'll look at new evidence filed a 9/11 lawsuit against Saudi Arabia, alleging the kingdom's embassy in Washington, D.C. may have funded a test run of the attacks. We'll speak with Harper's writer Andrew Coburn. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Capitol Hill, Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders is set to introduce a universal health care bill today that would expand Medicare coverage to include every American. Under emerging details of the plan, everyone 55 and older and children under 18 would qualify for Medicare during the program's first year, while the remainder of adults would be phased in over 4 years. The program would pay for doctors' visits, hospital stays, preventative and mental health care, and prescription drugs, while expanding Medicare to include vision, hearing, and dental care. To pay for the expansion, the bill would levy a new 2.2% income tax on all Americans and a 6.2% tax on employers who would no longer be required to provide health insurance to workers. The measure would also raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Ahead of today's rollout of the bill, 15 senators, comprising a third of the Democratic caucus, signed on as co-sponsors. They include New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, California's Kamala Harris. In the House, Democratic Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said she would not support Medicare for all and would instead focus on defending against Republican efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We'll have more on Senator Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan after headlines. In the Caribbean, residents of islands devastated by Hurricane Irma's Category 5 winds say they're running out of food and water. This is Sunil Sadhwani, a survivor on the island of St. Martin.
We are running out of the water right now, especially the drinking water. So kids are in the house, so we need the water to survive. So we pray to God that we get the water first, then electricity can come a little later, no problem. But the water is the main thing to survive on, you know.
The desperate pleas for food, water, and assistance came as the governments of France, Britain, and the Netherlands faced increasing criticism over their responses to the hurricane in their Caribbean territories after the storm leveled over 90% of buildings on some islands. In the U.S., the death toll from Irma rose to 22 as nearly 4.5 million Florida residents remained without power late Tuesday. FEMA reports at least 90% of homes in the Florida Keys suffered some damage, with a quarter of them destroyed completely. The U.S. Virgin Islands have also been devastated. In Texas, floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey that inundated Houston and other coastal cities last month created a toxic soup of poisonous chemicals and pathogens. That's according to a New York Times investigation, which found levels of E. coli at levels ranging from 4 times to 135 times the amount considered to be safe. Researchers also found floodwaters contained high levels of heavy metals, including lead and arsenic. Hurricane Harvey dropped a record-shattering 50 inches of rain around Houston, swamping sewage systems and flooding Superfund sites, petrochemical plants, and oil refineries. Go to our website at democracynow.org as we take you on a toxic tour of the Petro Metro. That's Houston. In China, authorities are set to evacuate 500,000 people as a pair of typhoons bear down on China's heavily populated East Coast. Taiwan canceled flights Wednesday and issued a warning to ships as Typhoon Talim threatened the island ahead of an expected landfall late Thursday on China's northern coast as a strong typhoon. To the south, Typhoon Doksuri threatens China's southeast and Vietnam as it strengthens over the South China Sea. Earlier this week, the storm brought flooding to the Philippines' capital, Manila, and surrounding provinces. In Washington, D.C., the Trump administration insisted it's taking the issue of climate change seriously, even though it won't ascribe extreme weather events to human activity. This is White House Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert speaking on Monday.
Are these storms giving this administration some pause when it comes to the issue of climate change and homeland security?
I was here in the 2004 cycle of hurricanes, 4 and 6 weeks that hit Florida. I think what's prudent for us right now is to make sure that those response capabilities are there. Causality is something outside of my ability to analyze right now. I will tell you that we continue to take seriously the climate change, not the cause of it, but the things that we observe.
The Trump administration's considering whether to further reduce the number of refugees allowed into the United States to fewer than 50,000. That's according to the New York Times, which reports the plan has the support of Homeland Security officials and senior White House advisor Stephen Miller. President Trump has already capped the number of refugees resettled annually in the U.S. at 50,000, less than half the 110,000 refugees admitted under President Barack Obama. The White House has named Hope Hicks, a 28-year-old longtime advisor to Donald Trump, as the administration's communications director. Hicks formerly served as Trump's director of strategic communications, where she was known for a hands-off approach on allowing the president free rein to use Twitter and other social media. Hicks is the fourth person to hold the position, replacing Anthony Scaramucci, who lasted just 10 days on the job. In Hong Kong, President Trump's former chief political strategist, Steve Bannon, praised Chinese President Xi Jinping as a wise leader Tuesday as he delivered a keynote address on economic nationalism and populism to a group of hedge fund managers and investors. Outside the forum, a group of protesters chanted, "No Bannon, no racism," and held a banner reading, "Nazis are not welcome here." This is Sally Tang, one of the demonstrators.
Why is he here with all the bankers, all the billionaires? It's not for us. It's not for the mass people and the majority of the people in Hong Kong. It's just for the rich people. So on the one hand, we are fighting in solidarity with the U.S. and mass people against Donald Trump. And on the other hand, we want to fight in unity to fight against racism and nationalism.
In Saudi Arabia, human rights groups warn an execution is imminent for a man who claims he was tortured as a teenager into confessing to crimes he did not commit. Amnesty International reports the family of 21-year-old Abdul Karim al-Hawaj was told Monday the Saudi Supreme Court upheld a death sentence for the young man over his alleged role in anti-government protests during Arab Spring uprisings in 2011 and 12. Amnesty says al-Hawaj is among at least 33 members of Saudi Arabia's minority Shia Muslim community who are currently facing the death penalty for alleged activities deemed a risk to national security. Meanwhile, a panel set up by the Saudi monarchy has cleared the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition of any wrongdoing in the deaths of civilians following a string of deadly airstrikes in Yemen. This is Saudi legal advisor Mansour Ahmed al-Mansour.
Until the moment of preparing this report, we have not found serious international violations in Yemen. The presence of innocent civilian victims in the war is because of mistaken bombardment and the presence of mistakes. This exists, and we have previously said that.
On Tuesday, Human Rights Watch accused the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition of committing war crimes, blaming it for the deaths of 39 civilians in the last 2 months alone. The war in Yemen has killed more than 10,000 people and has exacerbated a famine that's left 7 million people on the brink of starvation. Yemen's health and sanitation systems have been left devastated amidst a cholera epidemic that sickened more than 600,000 people. In Bangladesh, refugees who fled government-led violence in neighboring Burma say they're running out of food and that no more aid is coming. The dire warning came as the UN Refugee Agency said 370,000 Rohingya Muslim refugees have fled since Burma's military began slaughtering civilians August 25th. This is Rahmat, a Rohingya refugee who arrived in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, this week.
They killed many of my relatives there in Burma, and I've come here with 3 of my sons. They slaughtered many people in the village, 1/3 of the people of my village. They slaughtered them and threw them into a river.
On Monday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights warned the Burmese military's widespread violence against Rohingya Muslims is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Back in the United States, the Department of Justice announced Tuesday it will not bring federal charges against 6 Baltimore police officers over their roles in killing Freddie Gray, an African-American man from Baltimore who died after sustaining massive spinal injuries as he was transported in the back of a police van in April of 2015. 6 Baltimore police officers faced charges from the state's attorney's office related to the death, but prosecutors dropped all remaining charges in July 2016 after failing to win convictions for any of the first 4 officers to go on trial. In Seattle, Washington, Mayor Ed Murray resigned Tuesday after a 5th accuser stepped forward with allegations he sexually abused teenage boys years ago. In the latest allegation, a younger cousin says Murray molested him in New York in the 70s. Murray insists he's innocent of the charges, but said he'd step down as mayor to prevent a disruption to city services. In New York City, the incumbent mayor, Bill de Blasio, easily won the Democratic nomination Tuesday in a primary election that saw very low voter turnout. De Blasio campaigned on a platform that includes affordable housing, rent controls, a tax increase on wealthy New Yorkers to pay for the city's ailing subway, and an expansion of his administration's free preschool program to include children 3 years old and up. To see our extended conversation with Democracy Now's Juan Gonzalez about his new book, Reclaiming Gotham, go to our website at democracynow.org. And marriage equality pioneer Edith Windsor died Tuesday in New York at the age of 88. Windsor was lead plaintiff in a 2013 case at the U.S. Supreme Court challenging DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as between a man and a woman. Windsor had been forced to pay additional estate taxes because the IRS did not recognize her marriage to a woman, Thea Spire, who passed away in 2009. In a landmark 5-4 decision, the court ruled DOMA unconstitutional, meaning legally married same-sex couples are entitled to claim the same 1,100 federal benefits as heterosexual couples. This is Edie Windsor speaking in June of 2013, just after the Supreme Court's ruling.
I'm honored and humbled and overjoyed to be here today to represent not only the thousands of Americans whose lives have been adversely impacted by the Defense of Marriage Act, but those whose hopes and dreams have been constricted by the same discriminatory law. Children born today will grow up in a world without DOMA. And those same children who happen to be gay will be free to love and get married, as Thea and I did, but with the same federal benefits, protections, and dignity as everyone else.
Marriage equality pioneer Edith Windsor, dead at the age of 88. Tune in later in the broadcast when we bring you video of her marriage ceremony. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Washington, D.C., where Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is slated to introduce universal health care legislation today aimed at expanding Medicare coverage to include every American. In a New York Times op-ed piece published today, Sanders writes, quote, "This is a pivotal moment in American history. Do we, as a nation, join the rest of the industrialized world and guarantee comprehensive health care to every person as a human right? Or do we maintain a system that's enormously expensive, wasteful, and bureaucratic, and is designed to maximize profits for big insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industry, Wall Street, and medical equipment suppliers," unquote. Under Sanders' legislation, all children under 18 and all adults 55 and older would qualify for Medicare during the program's first year. The remainder of adults would be phased in over 4 years until everyone is covered by Medicare. 15 senators have so far signed on as co-sponsors, including New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, California Senator Kamala Harris. This is Senator Sanders speaking at the People's Summit in Chicago in July.
Think back 5 years ago. There was at that point widespread belief that the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, was about as far as we could go as a nation in health care. That's about it. Past Obamacare, can't do any more. Today, as you know, that view is radically changing. Nurses, thank you for your help on this. Today, all over our country, the American people understand that there is something profoundly wrong when we remain the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, not a privilege. And there is also something profoundly wrong when millions of Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs that their doctors prescribe. And what the American people from coast to coast are catching on to is the function of health care is to provide quality care to all people, not to make billions in profits for the insurance companies or the drug companies.
The introduction of the Medicare for All Act comes after Republicans repeatedly failed to push through their legislation to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. The Republicans' efforts sparked sustained grassroots protests led by disability activists and healthcare professionals. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Michael Leidy, Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association. National Nurses United has long advocated for a Medicare for All system. Michael, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what has happened just in the last 2 weeks, from 0 senators co-sponsoring to what are we at now, 15 and counting?
15 and counting, Amy, and it's a beautiful day. It's an exciting day for this movement to guarantee health care for all. We have literally seen in the last 2 weeks the ascension of this movement for improved Medicare for all. It's something we haven't really seen even in going back to the Hillary Care days, where this groundswell is organic. It's a prairie fire across the country. We've seen just one example, 2 million impressions on Twitter on the Roseanne DeMauro, our executive director's demand for these senators to sign on to Senator Sanders' bill. So this groundswell, we had town halls in California this week. We've had hundreds of people come out demanding this reform. It is extraordinarily popular, and I think we have overcome an amazing amount. The political establishment on the Democratic side and certainly on the Republican side did not want this to happen, and yet here we are. And it reflects the fact that Medicare for All and improved Medicare for All is more popular than the Affordable Care Act and more popular than the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It worked, Medicare works, and so here we are. I think it's really an amazing day. Americans should have a lot of hope, I think.
I wanted to go to just who is supporting this. Senator Sanders introduced single-payer health care 3 times before. This is the first time he's had any co-sponsors. California Senator Kamala Harris was the first to sign on. That seemed to break the ice. And at last count, 15 Senate Democrats co-sponsored, including New Jersey's Cory Booker, New York's Kirsten Gillibrand, Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey of Massachusetts, Al Franken of Minnesota, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, Brian Schatz and Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. However, Democratic leadership has yet to jump on board. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi have both declined to support the bill. So talk about the significance and whether it matters, whether the leadership leads or simply follows and gets on board if it gets support.
Well, I think what's extraordinary is that the majority of the Democratic caucus in the House has signed on to H.R. 676. 70% of Minority Leader Pelosi's constituents support improved Medicare for all. I think she just doesn't get it. The only way to maintain the gains of the Affordable Care Act is to extend and build on that foundation by eliminating the insurance company premiums, deductibles, and copays, and really guarantee health care for all through the Medicare system. That and the fact that she hasn't signed on yet, I think it's a matter of time.
So, Michael Leidy, lay out what you understand, and have you spoken to Bernie Sanders, what you understand he's doing today, what exactly this bill calls for?
Well, this bill calls for a system where we literally take the healthcare industry model of revenue and profits and transform our healthcare into a system based on the morality of caregiving. And that is a fundamental difference where, as he said in the clip that you showed, Amy, these healthcare players, the pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, hospital corporations, medical device manufacturers, and behind them all, Wall Street, are profiting on human suffering. And that is going to end because we're going to guarantee health care regardless of one's ability to pay. Yes, everyone contributes, but the patient care that you get will be based upon what you need, not what you can afford. And that's a fundamental transformation in the healthcare system in this country. And people are desperate for that security. Frankly, a third of the country or more has deductibles of greater than $2,000 a year. This bill eliminates that. The cost sharing that's endemic to Medicare will be gone, and those are barriers to care. The insurance companies looking over your shoulder, if you're a doctor or a nurse when you're caring for a patient or deciding how long they should stay in the hospital, that's gone, that kind of interference. Doctors and nurses put in charge of health care, patients getting the care they need, people having real health security. That's what Senator Sanders is doing today.
So talk about the phasing in. I mean, we're talking about Medicare for All, the idea that this extremely popular program of people 65 years and older have, Medicare, just dropping that age to 0 to include the entire population. But it's not happening all at once.
Well, it is important to recognize that part of the issue within healthcare is that we have a lot of people concentrated in Medicare who, of course, need a lot of services. So it's a very good idea to include young people who have less intense healthcare needs. So putting 0, that is at birth, to 18-year-olds in the plan is a really good thing to kind of stabilize the system initially and then also cover those who are 55 and older. Those are the ones with the greatest need, who have the hardest time finding insurance that can actually cover what they need as health care. So those two things make sense. And that's a huge chunk of the population. Then when you get to between 18 and 55, you're really dealing with the employer-based insurance system. And that it's appropriate to take some time to unwind that. We hear a lot about how invested people are or how complicated that might be. I don't think it's necessarily complicated, but it does take some time to unwind that system that has been the basis of healthcare since World War II. So I think a few years to do that is perfectly reasonable.
I want to turn to President Trump, speaking about health care in July during a lunch with Senate Republicans.
We have no Democrat help. They're obstructionists. That's all they're good at, is obstruction. They have no ideas. They've gone so far left. They're looking for single payer. That's what they want. But single payer will bankrupt our country because it's more than we take in for just health care. So single payer is never going to work, but that's what they'd like to do. They have no idea what the consequence will be, and it will be horrible, horrible health care where you wait online for weeks to even see a doctor.
Michael Leidy, your response. Michael, your response. We're talking to Michael Leidy, Director of Public Policy for the National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association. I'm going to give it one more try to see if Michael can hear us. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
Can you respond to President Trump?
I can hear you, Amy, yes.
Can you respond to President Trump? We'll go to break. We'll come back to you.
Well,
Michael Leidy is...
Respond to President Trump.
Yes, to respond to what he's saying.
President Trump has said he likes Australia. Well, this is very similar to the Australian system. No cost sharing, guaranteed health care for all, elimination of the role of the insurance companies. So this is something that, in fact, President Trump should welcome. This is not the Affordable Care Act. This is not something that we've obviously instituted before, so it's an opportunity for him to do something actually positive for the country and for everyone as a whole. So I think that the opportunity here is to bring folks together. This is a publicly financed, privately delivered reform that actually represents kind of the best of what we can bring to this issue, because we're going to be putting doctors and nurses in charge. That's what we hear from the right all the time. We need doctors and nurses, clinicians in charge, and we need patient-centered care. Well, this is exactly it. This is the kind of great healthcare system that we could create in the U.S.
Michael Leidy, I want to thank you for being with us. Of course, we'll follow up on this tomorrow because Senator Bernie Sanders, the former presidential candidate, is introducing Medicare for all today, at least expected to. A couple of weeks ago, as usual, he had no co-sponsors. He's introduced it a few times before. But today, just in the last few weeks, begun with Kamala Harris, the senator from California, one after another Democratic senator signed on, and at last count, it's 15 Democratic senators supporting the Medicare for All bill. Michael Leidy, Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association, thanks so much for joining us. When we come back, the second meeting of the so-called Election Integrity Commission takes place at St. Anselm College in New Hampshire. We'll get the latest. Stay with us.
Come labor, get ready to dance for your bread. My son, I was once where you stand. There's a beast with insatiable hunger. Its minions need crafters and skilled working hands. Needs a fortress high in the hilltops. And we are the great chosen crew. But I am a lowly carpenter, so what have I power to do? Oh, misery, call us to rise up at dawn, to turn way as fast as we can. We may be the mortar that cradles the brick, but I am just one grain of sand. And don't tell me of tossing the wrenches, it only brings pleasure and pain. And we are all lowly carpenters, so where we're taken is where we'll remain. And the master shall govern with unbroken backs. Look down from the top of the hills. You can cry through the night just as much as you like.
Lonely Carpenter by Mr. Brew here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to the growing controversy over President Trump's so-called Election Integrity Commission. The commission held its second meeting Tuesday in Manchester, New Hampshire, even as it faces a series of lawsuits and calls for the resignation of its vice chair, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. President Trump convened the commission to look into his allegations of voter fraud during the 2016 presidential election, but many voting rights advocates worry the commission aims to lay the groundwork for a nationwide voter suppression effort. At Tuesday's contentious meeting, the witness list was comprised of 100% white men, including the far-right pro-gun activist John Lott Jr., who proposed requiring voters to first pass a background check.
I would like to just make a suggestion that might possibly help overcome part of this problem, and that is, Think about applying the background check system that we use for purchasing guns, the NICS system, for voting. And, you know, Democrats have long been concerned about voter suppression, but they've also long lauded the background check system on guns.
That's John Lott Jr., author of the 1998 book, More Guns, Less Crime, which some call the Bible of the gun lobby. Well, at Tuesday's meeting at St. Anselm College, the commission's vice chair, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, also claimed New Hampshire's 2016 election results were tainted by people flooding across borders to cast ballots there. Kobach was reiterating a false claim he also made in a recent article for the far-right news outlet Breitbart, where he is a paid columnist. In the article, he claimed voter fraud elected Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan, who beat out Republican Kelly Ayotte, citing people using out-of-state licenses as evidence. In fact, New Hampshire allows residents who have out-of-state licenses, like college students, to vote. Many residents with out-of-state licenses who voted legally in the election have come forward to refute Kobach's claims. His false claims drew criticism both from the host of Tuesday's meeting, New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner, as well as Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, who called the comments absurd.
Making this equation that somehow people not updating their driver's license is an indicator of voter fraud would be almost as absurd as saying that if you have cash in your wallet, that's proof that you robbed a bank. I think it's a reckless statement to make.
Both the Maine and New Hampshire Secretaries of State are on that election commission. We're joined by two guests here in New York. Ari Berman is with us. Ari is senior reporter at Mother Jones, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His recent piece, Lawsuits, Falsehoods, and a Lot of White Men, Trump's Election Commission Meets Amid Growing Controversy. And in Washington, D.C., Kristen Clark is with us, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. The group has filed a complaint against Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. Okay, Ari Berman, let's begin with you. You were tweeting like crazy yesterday. Talk about what happened.
Well, I think it's important first to note that this commission is predicated on a gigantic lie, which is that millions of people voted illegally in the 2016 election. There's absolutely no evidence of that. If Donald Trump hadn't made that statement, there would be no commission. So first off, this commission is predicated on a completely illegitimate statement. Secondly, this commission has been steeped in controversy from the very, very beginning. First, with the makeup of the commission, people like Chris Kobach, who have a long history of suppressing votes, leading the commission. Then you have the fact that they requested the voter data of every single American, which led to fears that it would lead to widespread voter suppression. There have been at least 7 lawsuits filed against the commission. There's been evidence they've been using personal emails to conduct their business, the very thing the Republicans criticized Hillary Clinton for. So all of this was the backdrop to the meeting in New Hampshire. And we heard a number of extremely radical things. First off, the idea of a background check for voting from John Lott, the NRA's go-to expert, was the craziest thing that I've heard yet from this commission, and that's saying a lot. You have Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State and the commission's vice chair, who was leading the meeting, saying that voter fraud tipped the election in New Hampshire. There's absolutely no evidence of this, but nonetheless, he still is making this claim. He's also a paid columnist for Breitbart, the so-called platform for the alt-right, which likely violates government ethics laws because he's using his platform as head of this commission to then profit for websites like Breitbart. Then you had all sorts of other experts on this commission making lots of falsehoods about voter fraud. So you add all of this stuff up, and what's happening is that there are all of these lies about voter fraud that are laying the groundwork for a massive voter suppression campaign. What I'm concerned about is all of the radical things we're hearing are becoming normalized by this commission, that people are going to take it seriously because it's a presidential commission, even if it has no legitimacy to begin with.
Let's turn back to Tuesday's meeting when the vice chair of the so-called Election Integrity Commission, Kobach, claimed people are flooding across borders to vote in New Hampshire from other states, suggesting we'll never know the legitimacy of the election. Kobach's comments provoke criticism from New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner, who is hosting the meeting in Manchester. This is Kobach, followed by Gardner.
Last week, the Speaker of the New Hampshire House of Representatives issued a letter indicating that 5,000 of roughly 6,500 people who registered under the same-day registration rule on the day of the election on November 8th, 2016, about 5,300 of them, as of 10 months later, still had not obtained a New Hampshire driver's license, which is required of residents within 60 days after moving to the state, nor had they registered a vehicle in the state of New Hampshire. And so this is obviously a subject of concern because there have often been anecdotal reports of people driving into New Hampshire because it's a same-day registration state and voting because it's a battleground state that can swing either way. We will never know the answer regarding the legitimacy of that particular election. Unlike my state of Kansas, which doesn't have people flooding across the border to participate in primaries, to possibly cast a vote, in New Hampshire, it's a swing state. Everybody comes here. I remember when I was a college student at Harvard, I came up here to work on the primary for Bob Dole, and there wasn't same-day registration back then, but if there had been, I know a few people who would have been tempted to say, well, I'm living in a hotel here for a week, maybe I'll cast a vote.
The question of whether our election, as we have recorded it, is real and valid. And it is real and valid. And
So that's New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner refuting the claims of the vice chair of the commission, Chris Kobach. And there are a lot of calls from New Hampshire for Gardner to quit this commission, saying no matter what he does on the commission, he's legitimizing it. Kristen Clark of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, you have a complaint filed around this commission. Your response to what they're saying and your concerns about what you heard yesterday.
One thing that deeply concerns me about the commission is the way that it's structured. It is indeed stacked with individuals who have made a career out of pushing voter suppression efforts across our country. But, you know, yesterday's meeting was not one that allowed for a real or robust discussion about some of the false claims and data that had been put on the table by Chris Kobach, by John Lott and others. You had Gardner in there who rightfully rejected Kobach's claims about fraudulent votes in his state as reckless, but he truly was a lone voice of dissent in that room. The commission put together a panel. There were about 12 people that the public had an opportunity to listen to yesterday across day, a very long day, 3 panels. Every single speaker that presented to the commission yesterday was a white male. And what I find problematic about that is that voting is something that is central in American democracy. Voting at the end of the day is about inclusion of all voices. It's about having the voices of all people heard. And this is a commission that has a preconceived agenda and its existence is solely to lay the groundwork for what will ultimately be an aggressive national push of laws like photo ID requirements, burdensome proof of citizenship requirements, John Lott's new and wacky suggestion that we use gun-type background checks on voters. I mean, this is what the commission is racing towards. It wants a world in which we normalize voter suppression. It wants a world in which we make the norm restrictions on access to the ballot box. One of the reasons why the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is fighting this administration in court and working to push back against this commission is because we see its agenda as ultimately dangerous to American democracy. When we were in court 2 weeks ago, the judge was scolding of the administration for its failure to be transparent. During their first meeting, they failed to disclose the documents and materials that they relied upon in their entirety. And the administration had to beg the court for forgiveness. in the lead up to yesterday's meeting, we saw a little more disclosure this time, a little bit more transparency, but a lot of those materials that the commission is marshaling are false data, like Kobach's claims that thousands of people voted fraudulently in New Hampshire's election. We know that that's not true. We know that Kobach is somebody who has targeted students. He's targeted African Americans and Latinos throughout his career with voting restrictions, and is somebody who has made a career out of making it harder for vulnerable communities in our country to vote.
Ari Berman.
Well, I think what Kobach said about New Hampshire is very revealing about what this commission plans to do. First, he takes a fact, which is that thousands of people used out-of-state driver's licenses in New Hampshire, which is totally legal, completely misconstrues a completely legitimate fact as evidence of fraud, repeats that fraud in a Breitbart column. It's all over the place. It's on Drudge Report. It was covered everywhere on the right as proof of fraud, even though it was nothing of the sort. Then he's using that false claim of fraud to attack same-day voter registration in New Hampshire, which is really important because Election Day registration, the ability to register and vote on the same day, increases voter turnout more than any other thing you can do. Because a lot of people don't register before the election. They miss cutoffs. Remember in New York's primary, you had to switch parties like 6 months before the election. We have these crazy kind of laws. Election Day registration allows a lot of people who might otherwise not participate to be able to cast a ballot. And these are the kind of things they're going after. They're both going after policies that make it easier to vote, like Election Day registration, which are so important, and then they're trying to put in place all of these policies to make it harder to vote. And you look at what's happening in Kansas. Kobach cited his home state. Well, in Kansas, instead of Election Day registration, they have a law requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, meaning you have to show your passport, your birth certificate, or naturalization papers to be able to register to vote, which a lot of people don't have those documents. That has blocked 1 in 7 Kansans from being able to register to vote, over 30,000 people. So Kobach's home state is a microcosm of voter suppression efforts, and he's trying to export these efforts all across the country.
I wanted to talk about the significance of an email by Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation sent to Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Von Spakovsky wrote, "If they are picking mainstream Republican officials and/or academics to man this commission, then it'll be an abject failure because there aren't any that know anything about this or who have paid any attention to this issue over the years." Talk about his significance and this email.
Well, this is such an incendiary email, really a smoking gun email. Hans von Spakovsky, who's at the Heritage Foundation as a member of this commission, has been really the leading voice pushing the myth of voter fraud and pushing voter suppression efforts, both inside and outside the government. When he was in the George W. Bush Justice Department, in the Civil Rights Division, he was described by former lawyers as the point person for undermining the Civil Rights Division history of protecting voting rights. So he's a very, very controversial figure. He sent an email to Attorney General Jeff Sessions back in February of 2017, so months before this commission had even been constituted, saying that they should exclude Democrats, saying that they should exclude mainstream Republicans, saying they should exclude academics. All of the people who have expertise in this issue should be excluded. And this shows that the fix was in from the very, very beginning. That Mike Pence at the first meeting of this commission said, we have no preconceived notions of preordained results. In fact, von Spakovsky's email shows the exact opposite, that the Democrats who were chosen were mere fig leaves, that the power of this commission was always going to rest with people like Chris Kobach and Hans von Spakovsky, who have lied over and over about voter fraud, and that legitimate officials in the Republican Party who have studied this issue, secretaries of states who are Republicans, academics who have long looked at this issue, would be excluded from the very, very beginning. So we knew from the beginning this commission was illegitimate because it was predicated on a gigantic lie. But this email just confirms exactly what they were planning to do.
Kristen, I wanted to end by asking you about this report from Reuters. The ideologically divided U.S. Supreme Court Tuesday handed a win to Republicans in Texas by putting on hold rulings that said electoral districts drawn by state lawmakers discriminated against minority voters. Talk about the significance of this.
You know, what's unfortunate is that this means that maps, redistricting maps that have been found to be unconstitutional will now stand in the state of Texas. Texas is an interesting place. This is a state now where multiple courts in 2017 have found that state officials have acted with discriminatory purpose, with discriminatory animus when it comes to voting. And that's whether we're talking about by instituting a restrictive photo ID law or in the way that they've redrawn district boundaries in different parts of the state. It's remarkable in 2017 to have a court find that elected officials are acting with animus. The Supreme Court's decision yesterday means that residents across that state have to live in a world in which unconstitutional maps are in place. It's my hope that all of these cases now pending in Texas and across the country reach a resolution point soon. In 2013, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Shelby County, Alabama v. Holder that truly opened up the floodgates of voter suppression across our country. We have seen voting discrimination at a rate and intensity that we have not seen in previous years. The Election Integrity Commission is part of this nationwide assault that we are seeing on the right to vote. One other significant development yesterday was members of Congress, including Senator Schumer, issued calls for defunding the commission and have called for the commission to be disbanded. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, that's something that we are fighting for because we deem this commission to be an unprecedented tool to promote voter suppression. We deem this to be a vehicle to incentivize state officials across the country to put in place barriers to the franchise. And we should be at a point in American democracy where we're working on making it more inclusive, where we're working to expand participation rates and working to figure out how everyone can have their voice heard. And at every turn, this administration has made clear their hostility to the right to vote.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Kristen Clark, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Organization filed a complaint against Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, Vice Chair of President Trump's Election Integrity Commission, as he calls it. And Ari Berman now with Mother Jones. He covers voting rights. When we come back, will the 9/11 case finally go to trial? We'll speak with Harper's editor, Andrew Coburn. Stay with us.
I know a woman who feels every moment with sorrow and joy. She is blown by the wind. Her heart moves so quickly, it tires her to follow. But this world wasn't made for such sensitive things. And I want to sing her a song that will free her to feel what she feels without judgment or shame. All of her power right beside all her pain. And I know a mother who cannot remember. She died to the dreams she once carried inside. And she raised a daughter who cannot forgive her for failing to lead her with wings into life. And I want to sing her a song that redeems her for all that she
I Know a Woman by Jasper Lipak. Go to DemocracyNow.org to see our full segment on Edie Windsor, the marriage equality pioneer who died Tuesday here in New York at the age of 88. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the nation marks the 16th anniversary this week of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon, questions still swirl about the role of Saudi Arabia. 9/11 attacks were carried out by 19 hijackers. 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia. 16 years later, 9/11 families and survivors are continuing their efforts to take Saudi Arabia to trial. Just this week, the New York Post reported new evidence presented in the case alleging the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. paid for 2 Saudi nationals who were living in the U.S. undercover to fly from Phoenix to Washington, D.C., quote, in a dry run for the 9/11 attacks, unquote. The family's lawyers say the new allegations offer, quote, a pattern of both financial and operational support by the Saudi government. We go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Andrew Coburn. His latest piece in Harper's is headlined Crime and Punishment. Will the 9/11 case finally go to trial? Welcome, Andrew. Can you please lay out that case?
Well, the case, it's a consolidation of various lawsuits that were brought in almost immediately after the attacks. And it alleges that the hijackers received material support and backing, and both financial and organizational, from agents of the Saudi government, acting in their capacity as agents of the Saudi government, and therefore that the Saudi government is itself liable for the attacks on 9/11.
And talk about who the plaintiffs are.
Well, they're a whole bunch of people. They 6,500 roughly in all. They are first of all, bereaved families, widows, parents, children, orphaned, or not orphaned, but bereaved families whose husbands, sons, mothers were killed in the attacks. Also includes survivors, people who were in the attacks but managed to at least escape with their lives, even if they were injured. And it also includes insurance companies who, had to pay out millions and billions of dollars in claims, but are now seeking to get some of that money back from the people they allege actually caused the attacks.
Andrew, last year I interviewed former Senator Bob Graham, the former chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, co-chair of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into the 9/11 terrorist attacks. This is what he said.
Immediately after 9/11, the government began to look for suspects who had helped these hijackers, and they focused on Iraq. They even had a concocted story that a representative of Saddam Hussein had met with al-Qaeda operatives in Prague, in the Czech Republic. That turned out to be false. My feeling is that what happened is they wanted to go to war with Iraq, had wanted to, particularly people like Cheney and Rumsfeld, and it was embarrassing to find out that the information that was becoming available seemed to more point to Saudi Arabia as having been the country that aided the 9/11 rather than Iraq. And so the response to that is, let's suppress the information about Saudi Arabia's involvement so that we don't confuse the people in the Congress as we push hard to get authorization for war in Iraq.
That's the former U.S. Senator Bob Graham. Talk more about what he's saying, Andrew Coburn.
Well, that's right. I mean, in a way, there's one thing that the Bush administration and Senator Graham agreed on, which was that for the hijacking, for the 9/11 operation to succeed, they had to have had the support of the structured support of a nation state. I mean, in terms of money, in terms of contacts, in terms of, these were a bunch of basically sort of hicks who, most of them, who, arrived in this country, didn't speak English, didn't know people, and so they were all taken care of and found places to live and given money and, steered to flying lessons. It was a very sophisticated or well-organized operation, and that had to have been, in Graham's view, and it seems in mine too, had to have been done by a state. Now, the Bush administration tried to say it was Iraq. In fact, they so wanted it to be Iraq, or wanted people to believe it was Iraq, that interrogators at Guantanamo were under instructions to torture detainees in Guantanamo into admitting, falsely, that this link between Iraq and the 9/11 hijackings.
So why was Iraq the focus after? I mean, if you polled most people in the United States, they would not know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Why was it in the interest, do you believe, of the state to do this? Well, first of all, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is so sacrosanct in the eyes of the, whatever you want to call it, the sort of ruling apparatus in this country, and it runs very, very deep. There's all sorts of aspects to it. Most vividly, obviously, the huge financial benefits that flow, at least to the U.S. defense industry, the military-industrial complex in terms of arms contracts, consultancy contracts for retired general officers. There's a very close sort of symbiotic relationship between the two. The whole relationship of the oil companies to Saudi Arabia, things that you wouldn't think of. For example, every American, I've been informed that every time an American military flight flies over Saudi Arabia, which they really have to do to get to the big bases in the Gulf, they have to ask permission from the Saudis, which the Saudis, just to jerk our chain, occasionally refuse. There were subsidies on the price of oil for a long time. There was allegedly support in the worldwide network of mosques. So, this was the idea that we would, even though they just attacked us, that we would sort of suddenly turn on the Saudis, I think just didn't compute. Can you talk about Michael Jacobson, who he was and what he uncovered, Andrew? He's absolutely key. Let me say, Jacobson was an investigator on the Senate, the joint inquiry by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, which was chaired by Bob Graham, that was set up right after the attacks. Jacobson was an investigator in that, and really early on, he noticed an odd discrepancy, an odd mention in FBI files here in Washington that said that one of the hijackers had been in contact with an FBI informant. He thought this is quite interesting, and he wanted to put in to go to San Diego. This is a hijacker, sorry, I should say, who'd been living in San Diego. He pushed to go to San Diego to look into the files in the local FBI office. Interestingly, the then head of the FBI, Mr. Mueller, Robert Mueller, now investigating the Trump allegations about Donald Trump, moved heaven and earth to stop Jacobson going to San Diego. Nevertheless, the committee insisted he do so, and he went there and found most of what we know about the Saudi connection. He found that in the files there was plenty of information about a Saudi agent, Mr. al-Bayoumi, who everyone in the FBI certainly out there believed was a Saudi agent, who had been in close contact with the hijackers, who had found them a place to live in San Diego, had opened bank account for them, had helped them, introduced them to people who helped them get flying lessons, helped them to get driver's licenses, had basically been their case officer, it seemed. This was all turned up in, I mean, I could go on, there's other people, there were checks that went from the Saudi embassy in Washington that went more or less, I mean, indirectly, but in a pretty straightforward procedure, to the hijacker or to Mr. Bayoumi for looking after the hijackers. Mr. Bayoumi himself worked for a company owned by the Saudi Ministry of Defense. Andrew, we just have 20 seconds, but the subtitle of your piece, will the 9/11 case finally go to trial? Will it? Yes. I mean, despite the best efforts of the U.S. government and court system, it's moving remorselessly toward that. We've had the complaint, we've had the motion to dismiss, that'll be answered. Looks like sometime next year we'll actually get an actual trial going. And the Saudis, I might say, are freaked out about this. They're making every effort to derail this thing, to try and get the law changed so that they can't be sued. We're going to have to leave it there, but we will continue to follow it. Andrew Coburn, Washington editor for Harper's Magazine, will link to your piece, Crime and Punishment. And that does it for today's broadcast. My co-host, Juan Gonzalez, continuing speaking tour. You can check our website at Democracy Now! He'll be in Tempe on Thursday and at Austin as well. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.